casino culture, right? Where it's like crypto can go two ways. It can go in this like really like open, ground up, innovative thing where people are developing and it's very sustainable. Blockchain makes it more sustainable than open source in general because you have the value there that you can distribute. But then the problem is that crypto can go this other way, which is casino culture. And casino culture is essentially, where people are spinning up 10,000 accounts, taking random actions on this protocol, trying to get an airdrop to make a lot of money like overnight. And, some people win that game and some people don't do as well.
Episode 50 of Invest in Music with Graeme Boy, the founder of Stack. Today we're here to talk about Onchain points and their latest seed round. As a reminder, you can collect this episode on investinmusic.xyz. It's the best way to support our guests. So without further ado, let's talk about all things points with Graeme Boy of Stack. All right, we are back from ETH Denver. We got Graeme, the founder of Stack, in the building. How are we feeling today, Graeme?
Good. How are you?
Doing wonderful, man. It's been really amazing to watch you and Stack evolve over the last few months. As I'm sure everyone has heard, points are a really big narrative right now. You're fresh off announcing the seed round that you guys just talked about earlier this week. So I guess high level, would love for you to give a quick intro into Stack and then maybe how you got to where you are today.
Sure, sounds good. So Stack is a way to bring loyalty points on chain. It's comprised of two parts. There's a chain that runs a core points protocol, which can be extended without any intermediaries by brands who want to use that. And then second, it's an interface and developer SDKs for managing the points program. It's a high level overview. And then, the way we got there was starting with this idea of attestations, which is, how we think about points as well, as opposed to tokens. And then explored, what are the realistic use cases for attestations. And we sort of decided that quantitative attestations like points and reputation were a really good form of attestation as opposed to qualitative ones just saying something about somebody on chain.
So I want to caveat that a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are non-technical. They're typically into music. They have a little bit of crypto here and there, but I think when they hear words like attestation, quantitative and qualitative attestation, it might be a little bit hard for them to wrap their head around. Can you maybe take a step back and just talk about why points are something that is interesting to you, and then maybe why you decided to go so deep down this on-chain points conversation, maybe how that differs from some of the points program we've seen in crypto in the past?
Yeah, that makes sense. So Vitalik wrote this paper called Soulbound, bringing the soul into Web3, decentralized society. So that was all about basically creating types of tokens that are bound to the user, as opposed to being something that's tradable. And his theory there was that this would bring reputation and more legitimacy to the profiles that are using Web3, because you can give them these soul-bound things that can accrue reputation or something like that. So I left Mira about a year ago. We can talk about background a little bit later, but I left Mira and I wanted to focus on this idea of the soul-bound paper and try to productize that, because I view that as being my strength, is I can build a product that people can use. So I wanted to take this white paper and see what I could do with it. So instead of just building a protocol and just trying to put something out quickly, I decided to work with partners specifically and see what was useful in the realm of attestations and soulbound tokens. And so we started with prototypes that were very broad. So for example, just doing on-chain membership. We did a lot of CCIP, ENS subdomains, that kind of thing, before realizing that one of the great use cases for these soulbound tokens were kind of loyalty points and reputation systems. And so that's sort of the difference between sort of quantitative types of attestations, and then qualitative, on the other hand, might be something where you're just attesting to maybe somebody's KYC status on chain, which I think Coinbase is doing now, or you just want to say something like a review on chain of a product or something like that. So we decided to say, in the realm of attestations, we want to focus on quantitative attestations because we can just make a protocol that's very specific to that. And then I think the next question was where do we deploy that? And one strategy that was taken up a few months later by the Ethereum attestation service was to create an attestation protocol and deploy it to all of the chains, similar to how Uniswap gets deployed to lots of chains. But I thought that might not work very well for the types of attestations that we wanted to do. because it would still be very expensive to do an attestation on like Base or Optimism or L1. So we decided to go into the realm of doing a separate chain, and so we prototyped a lot of things. Like we prototyped some ZK stuff with like StarkNet, and we prototyped doing an L2 roll up to L1, and then eventually settled on this idea of doing an L3.
And I feel like the whole L3 conversation is one that I'm very excited to dive into the weeds on here. I want to kind of take a step back before we go super far down the rabbit hole. You mentioned that about a year ago you left Mirror. You've had quite an interesting journey in crypto, being involved with a lot of really credible projects for a long time. Can you go back to your earliest days in crypto and some of the roles that you played at those companies, and then what led you to wanting to start Stack and kind of take on this CEO and founder position in the company today?
Cool. Yeah. I started in crypto about 7 years ago. I'd been working as a software engineer and engineering manager for a couple of years. And then my friend launched this company called Numerai, and I consulted there for a little bit before they did a token. And Ethereum was still pretty new at that point. I think it was 2015, 2016. And then I just did some consulting there on like building up their engineering infrastructure and that sort of thing. And then I joined Dharma as a founding engineer. So Nadal Hollander he had created a white paper for that. And we ended up building a wallet that allowed anybody to on-ramp from debit card or bank account straight into a DeFi protocol. And that was a pretty successful product. And I think that was something that onboarded a bunch of people into like the DeFi system, because you could buy these tokens that were not on like Coinbase, for example. You could buy like Yearn at like $100 or $200, and it went up to like 40,000 or something. So that was a good onboarding tool, and the wallet worked really well, and that was acquired by OpenSea. Just before the acquisition, I left Dharma to become the CTO of Mirror.xyz. And that was sort of me saying, like, at the end of DeFi summer, I was sort of taking a break from the finance side, which was very stressful. I'd basically been working for like many years without taking a break. And a lot of the systems that I worked on were very like high stress, like a lot on the line, like financial, we had millions of dollars like in the protocol. And so I wanted to take a step back and basically do something a little bit like more fun and creative. And so that was, what Mirror was. It was like this writing platform that could integrate with blockchains. And so you could do things like crowdfunding. And so I did that for about a year and a half, and then that product was taking off, and I think it was like quite successful. And so I decided to start something new around this like attestation protocol idea.
Nice. And I know that Dharma was one of the first mobile DeFi apps that I ever used. I think at that time and place, everything was very browser heavy. Obviously, you're going very deep on staking and delegation, all these kind of things. And I remember just thinking that Dharma to me was one of like the first good mobile crypto apps. Obviously it's evolved a lot since then. Even going over to Mirror and what you built out with things like the Right Race, I know that it's always been a big focus of yours to make really high quality, usable consumer products. And I know that we started off talking about things like quantitative attestation, some of these more technical concepts. How do you think about the way that most people will interface with Stack and kind of what that consumer experience looks like so that they feel like they're still getting the same level of professional, easy to use products like you've seen with Dharma and Mirror now in the form of Stack today?
Right. Okay. That's a great set of questions. So my view has always been to try to expand the reach of crypto and try to like include more people. And so even things like Crypto Culture and Society that I started was like this learning forum for people to join, and we had a couple thousand people learn. One of the things that holds the ecosystem back in general is just the transaction fees. And so it makes everything into a sort of financialized ecosystem, because in order to take a transaction, you need to kind of expect that there's going to be a return on that capital in some form of, getting social capital or real returns in currency. And so I've always tried to like build a product that could onboard more people with less friction. So the Dharma wallet allowed you to just use a mobile wallet without needing a private key, but retaining the same like sense of decentralization by doing a smart contract wallet, and then having those like DeFi integrations be something that is trustless. So you're not actually putting a lot of trust in the Dharma team necessarily, because everything's managed on chain, but the onboarding experience is really easy. I think the same thing for Mirror. What allowed Mirror to be quite successful is we have these things called signing keys that were just automatically created in the browser that didn't hold any funds. So there was no risk of losing funds. But we could store those very securely in the browser. That allowed you to sign into the application and sign the content that you were posting. And then the content would be put on Arweave, which is decentralized. And so there wasn't any platform risk of using Mirror necessarily, because all of the data was kind of stored, in this sort of crypto network, Arweave. And the fees for that were very low. So it allowed us to do this thing where people could just come and write, and they could write very, easily without any transaction fees. But at the same time, they could interact with Ethereum by doing these like embeds. So trying to take like the cool things you could do with Ethereum, like, like Kickstarter for crowdfunding, something like that, or, auction. You could like embed an auction into your blog post. So I think I've always just been really interested in saying, like, what are the easy onboarding tools that make it so that you don't have a lot of friction signing up, like whether that's transaction fees or needing a private key, at hand, but then still get the benefits of decentralization, trustlessness, composability. And then with regards to Stack, we're trying to do something very similar where somebody can sign up to the product and receive an API key, and they can use an SDK to interact with the protocol. And then by doing it as an L3, the fees are very low. And the fees get lower the more people use it. So there's a sort of return, economies of scale, where the more people are using the chain, the fees get amortized, and so it gets lower. And the more people are using the SDK, the more we can batch the transactions. At the same time, users still own their own points program, and so they can always exit out of our system and like control it themselves with their own private keys. There's no platform risk there, and people can extend the point system without an intermediary. So they can just deploy their own extension to the protocol and create some kind of game on top of their point system, or they can, automatically assign badges or something like that based on like the points that people have accrued, and they can do that without needing to interact with us at all. So.
It's really fascinating to me that it's 2024 and we're still doubling down on how to make transactions usable to a mainstream audience. And I mean, even literally in today, ETH is mooning. I tried to make a swap on mainnet on Uniswap, and it was $150 in gas. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to go over to layer 2. This is the whole reason why we made layer 2, is to make this more accessible and cheap. And even today, the cost to make a transaction on Base or Optimism, and granted, this is going to change soon with the new protocol upgrade, but it's $1, $2 to make a swap. And so I think when we start to talk about things like layer 3, the immediate reaction can be like very intimidating because we're going so far down the rabbit hole. But I do think this North Star of being able to issue transactions for literally fractions of a penny that are being subsidized by, the platforms and the applications that are using these systems is fundamentally important. Because to your point, I think that so long as a user is thinking about having to pay a fee to make a transaction, there is always an expectation of that transaction needing to be quote unquote valuable. And I think that in the case of something like Stack, introducing loyalty programs to these apps, being able to do that in a way where the user doesn't have to get ETH in their wallet, pay gas fees, et cetera, it unlocks a very new set of products and experiences. And I'm really curious to hear how you guys are thinking about what type of experiences you want to see emerge on the back of something like Stack and the fact that it's built on a layer 3.
Right. Great. Yeah, totally agree. And one thing about the layer 3s, and I just want to caveat this because it's still somewhat of a controversial topic. All of these things are new ideas, right? And so they get some pushback in the beginning, which I think is healthy and good. Layer 3s have different security guarantees to layer 2s. And obviously layer 2s have very different security guarantees to layer 1. That is what allows them to become cheaper. But it also means that there are certain types of applications that you shouldn't probably do on a layer 3. So I would not do a DeFi protocol probably on a layer 3 because it's not a secure enough place to hold funds, because of like the data availability is not like as guaranteed as like an L2. So for things that are inherently financial and like high value, you can keep those on the L2. And then to your point, it's like $1 to $10 per transaction, but that might be okay if you're doing a really big financial transaction. And on March 12th, I believe it goes down significantly with the Denkun upgrade. So that should be reasonable. So when we talk about L3s, there's this like a class of applications that really makes sense for that. And I would put one thing into that I would put is probably e-commerce. So I'd be really excited to see somebody do an e-commerce platform on an L3, because I think that that will be really cheap for people to like buy things on something like, like a Farfetch that's created on an L3. I think that would work really well, and that could actually be better than using something like Stripe, to be honest. So I'm really excited for that. The other things that work really well in L3 are things like attestations that are valuable, but they're not like inherently this like directly financialized asset that you can have on the L3. And I think point systems are great for that. And so we get into this territory where people have been talking about point systems and loyalty systems in crypto for a long time, but putting the point system on an L2 or an L1 hasn't been feasible because the transaction fees are so expensive. So if you have a community of 20 million users and they're in a leaderboard accruing points, you can't really do that on an L1 because you'd be paying 100 and whatever, like $60 per transaction or something every time you added points to a user's account. And you wouldn't really be able to do that on an L2 because $1 per user would be like $20 million. So that's something that is likely to work quite well on an L3, and I think the security guarantees are worth that trade-off. So in terms of like where I see things going, it's a multi-year process. So it's not something that we're not just targeting like the current, points bubble as it were, which has come around very recently. We really want to see this be something that can be used by brands. So could crypto applications use this? There are some like big projects that have reached out that would be great to onboard their point systems on chain, and should be cheap for them, and they'll get all these benefits of the composability. But then also, larger brands could use it as well, and like we'll make it really easy for them and try to onboard them. Key features that you are asking for is, I think the composability is really interesting. So being able to say, like, can two brands have a loyalty point system, and then create some kind of collaboration or partnership where they allow the exchange of those points at some exchange rate that they kind of settle on. I think that that's a great use case. I think composability in terms of like other people being able to, access that data on something like Dune Analytics might be good too. We do want to keep the point systems sort of pseudonymous, so not inherently like public, but if you want to, you can just pull the data from Onchain. So I think that there are really interesting things that you can do with that, where teams can like build their own integrations that run entirely independently of like Stack's team, but they can just continue to build on this chain. So yeah, those are some of the things I'm interested in.
It's really interesting because the whole points conversation has really picked up in the last 3 to 4 months. And I think specifically today, we're kind of in this world where like meme coins are dominating the narrative right now. Like layer twos are starting to come into the question. And I think that a lot of people probably don't know that there even is a distinction between on-chain points and off-chain points. And so I think something that would be helpful for this audience is, can you give me an example of a project that's using off-chain points today? And then can you give me an example of a project that is thinking about or using on-chain points today, and how to rationalize those key differences and why that might be useful for you as a user of one of these products, that you might want your points to actually be on-chain versus off-chain?
Right, great. So there's a distinction between, I would say 3 types of points that you could have these days. And I wrote like this 2,500 word article with Katie from Archetype, and that goes into a lot of this, and you've written about this too. There's sort of off-chain points, there's on-chain points, which we're trying to do, and then there are tokens, and then those are like all distinct, and people quibble about which one is like the best way to go for loyalty systems. Probably thousands of projects in crypto are using off-chain points, and of course the whole Web2 is using off-chain points. So that's the status quo. And off-chain points, what that means is you have some database like Postgres or MongoDB or whatever people are using at these like airlines, and they store all of the points there off-chain. In crypto, what that allows you to do is do something like an airdrop or some redeemable for those point systems. And the way that it's done, if you don't mind me getting a little bit technical, is they take that database, which is consistent of rows, they translate that into a data structure called a Merkle tree, which is a tree structure in computer science. There's a root of that tree, which is called the Merkle root. Then they publish that Merkle root on chain wherever they want the redemption to happen. and then they give all of the users a proof. And that Merkle proof allows you to claim something like a token by proving that you have X many points. And sometimes these point systems are just internal, and sometimes they're public. So an internal one would be, like Uniswap, when they were configuring their token drop for their airdrop, it had some kind of internal representation of how people should be allocated tokens. And that could be thought of as like an internal point system. Then they created the Merkle root, they put it on chain, and they allowed you to claim a token based on, that allocation. So that's the kind of thing that people are doing currently. That's the status quo. Where we see things a little bit differently is that there's a chance for a new primitive here. And that's sort of what you heard me pitch at the Coinbase Venture Summit in November last year. The thesis was that as blockchains become more scalable, as you get things like L3s now, and even with like ZK, there are going to be new primitives that you could do that you couldn't do before. And I was trying to articulate what the most sort of low-hanging fruit are, or like what the most obvious applications are for these new primitives. And one thing that I thought of was point systems, because blockchains are inherently, like sort of game machines. They're like game engines. They're umpires for rules. So they enforce rules really well. And the sort of, when you're playing these games, the Ethereum accounts are like your players. The smart contracts are your umpire that's like, enforcing the rules. And then the thing that people basically get when they play that game are these tokens, and that's like the points. But now that blockchains are becoming more scalable, we might have a new type of point that isn't a token, like in ERC20 conventionally. It might be just a point, like a loyalty point. And so we're trying to introduce a new primitive. And so we're trying to find an interface for that, similar to ERC20, but just starting from first principles, thinking about, what would a standard be for loyalty points? And, I think that's quite different from ERC20. And then that gets us down the road of like points versus tokens, which I think is one of those like points of feedback that we've gotten, like why are points not just tokens, ERC20 tokens.
And I think that my answer to that would be tokens, in the way that you're describing it, are these very heavy, giant instruments where you have a total supply of 1 billion points. You have 50% allocated to a treasury. That treasury is holding hundreds of millions of dollars worth of these tokens. You can think about, even in the case of Uniswap, when they did their airdrop, they airdrop tokens to people. And so now you have this governance token that represents the way that you're changing the underlying protocol. It's governing, a treasury that has hundreds of millions of dollars in it. And I think that tokens have historically worked really well for these giant crypto protocols and projects that are storing tremendous amounts of value. To your point about I wouldn't put a DeFi project on a layer 3, it's logical to have a DeFi project on a layer 1, and it's logical to have a token that governs that protocol because it is so heavy and there's so much attached to it. I think where I start to get excited about the concept of loyalty programs and points is that consumer apps in crypto probably aren't going to have hundreds of millions of dollars of ETH staked in their platform. You're typically going to have a game where most users are buying $5, $10 worth of points. They're not looking to store their life savings in it. It's much more of a fun, gamified social interaction. And I think in those environments, being able to buy points for $5 on a credit card, not have it cost $100 in transaction fees, not needing to worry about that user storing $50,000 of ETH in that same wallet, there starts to emerge this different economy where I think a lot of teams don't want to launch a really heavy governance intensive token, but they do want to reward their users for playing in their ecosystem and using their app. And so I think for me, as we step into this new narrative of consumer crypto, layer 2, things like Base, mobile apps, progressive mobile apps, smart wallets, embedded wallets, all this cool stuff that's happening today, I think the idea of points becomes exciting to me because you can now start to play around with crypto incentives without having to do a giant governance token, which locks you into this whole other world that is, a 10-year plus journey, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Right. So that hits the nail on the head. So I would just like elaborate on that in the sense that ERC20s, projects also want those. And you don't really want to conflate these two because, particularly because the venue in which you trade the actual tokens, the ERC20s, are these like financial protocols. So you want to have that on the protocol, on the chain that has Uniswap or whatever. So you want that to be deployed to like Base or an L1. And then where you want to like run your points program, you don't want to have it be on the same chain because it would be too expensive. And so you need to like kind of separate those out. And when you separate out the tokens from the points, you don't want them to be confused. And so you're not going to use like the same name. You're not going to use the same basic interface. And then the interface that you would use for points doesn't have a large overlap with ERC20s, because points are more like attestations. Like they are issued by a brand or by a project to the user, or like maybe like the user is like buying it, but essentially it's issued to the user, and the user is not necessarily like trading them, because I don't think like Sephora would want their points like just arbitrarily traded without their permission, right? So there's kind of like just a different requirement there. And if we were to start from the ERC20s as the primitive for points, we would end up stripping out like 70% of it. Because if you think of like the interface for ERC20s, it's like transfer from, allowance, token symbol, name. All of those things are not relevant for points really, and to put them on chain. And so at that point, we would just like start from scratch with a better primitive for that use case. And that's essentially the concept that we're pitching here. Is like, what would a first principles primitive be for point systems?
And it's been really fun for us to play around with it. For those who have been following on Warpcast, we've been teasing this app called Boombox that's coming out in a few weeks. And we chose to work with Stack on that because we want to be introducing a gamified token incentive out of the gate, but we don't want to be issuing a heavy token. We don't want to be going into this world where there's governance of a treasury or anything like that. I think there's so much benefits in the way that we can gamify consumer experiences in crypto. And I think for me, being able to start an app with a point system out of the gate where users are aware that they're earning some form of internal currency. And I think we can go on from here maybe to the difference between what a crypto user expects versus what like a normal consumer expects from a loyalty program. But I don't know, for me, I just get really excited about using an on-chain points program because you get a lot of the benefits of tokenized incentives, but it's a lot less pressure. You're not going into this saying like, oh, we're prepping up for a giant airdrop in Q3 of 2024. And in the case of platforms like Friendtech and whatnot, I think you saw that their point systems were basically just being earmarked one-to-one with the expectation of a future token. What's the value of this protocol going to be? What's the value of this point going to be? And while there definitely is that expectation with crypto users, I don't think that behavior exists for like normal people. And I think as long as we're trying to reach a new audience, which is what you said has been your goal all along, I think it's important that we provide them with economic systems that are not meant to be like, you're earning billions of dollars from farming this app. It's just like, hey, I'm earning points every time that I check in. I'm earning points every time that I do an action. And maybe those can become valuable in the future, but they're not required to be valuable to be playing the game out of the gate.
Right, exactly. Yeah, super interesting. I mean, yeah, so people in the crypto ecosystem have been trained a little bit to expect token rewards for using the app, which is great. I think that's part of the ownership economy thesis, and like I think we want to do that. The trick is how to do it well, and I think we've seen a lot of airdrops not work that well. I would point out, some controversy around the Starknet airdrop, for example, where people just didn't know what actions to take in order to be called like a loyal early user. And so they tried lots of different things. And so they deployed small amounts of capital to all of the different protocols. They deployed their own protocols themselves. They did this or that thing. They, were on multi-sigs or whatever. Like there were a lot of things that people did there that they ended up just not earning any points for, because at the end of the day, the Starknet Foundation just decided arbitrarily, like this is how we want to reward people. I think point systems could serve this benefit of guiding people, hopefully without the direct expectation of like a one-to-one match point to token. But it is still like a really good way to guide people, and you can do drops along the way. So for example, you can have your points redeemable for some exclusive NFT or for like USDC, things like that. And at the end of the day, if you decide as a project to do a token, which, very supportive of, you can take the points and redeem them for that token, later. And then that decentralizes the ownership of the project. And I think that is what we're trying to build in crypto to a large degree, because we see a lot of like centralization of wealth with like AI and stuff, and we want to like decentralize a lot of these applications to the early users. Tokens are a good way to do that. And I think points are a good way to get started on that journey. And so I think that's where people are experimenting a lot with points now in crypto, because it's just a natural like onboarding mechanism and a natural way to lead to a token later. And then transitioning to them being on chain is a really good step, because we do want more data, written on EVM compatible environments. if that makes sense. So it's like we want to move things out of traditional databases. We want to move them on chain, even if it's just internal to the team. Like using like Solidity for like your programming environment in general is a good step, and it's going to be just allow the accounting to be better and like the auditability to be stronger.
And I think speaking from personal experience, having designed the Audius airdrop, the Optimism airdrop, ENS airdrop, Super airdrop, I mean, like this is literally the bread and butter of what me and my colleagues have done for the last couple of years. You basically have this multi-month process where you just take a snapshot of every action point that's happened on that project, and you just more or less, like I'm really overgeneralizing here, assign random weights to actions that you deem to be valuable. And so you say, on this project, if they staked here, I consider this to be valuable. If they registered this thing here, I consider this to be valuable. If you joined before this date, I consider this to be valuable. And then you basically have the 0 to 1 moment where there was no token, and then there's a token. You introduce this giant asset into the ecosystem. You have this big kumbaya moment where everyone's getting thousands of dollars worth of tokens. You have a Uniswap pool going live alongside of it. The price is fluctuating like crazy. The valuation goes up 10, 20x overnight. Then it comes crashing down 99% again. It's a fucking shit show. I mean, it's basically a crypto IPO if we're being real here. And I think one thing that I've found is that once teams launch a token, they are so hesitant to keep iterating with ways to reward and incentivize actions with those tokens because they have this expectation that these tokens are these really concrete, valuable instruments that need to be kept close to the chest. They should not be distributed to people. And I think something that I pushed a lot of teams to think about is you want to be giving your users incentives for basically everything that they're doing. And I think in the world that exists today, the airdrop is this one giant moment. And I want to give a lot of credibility to teams like Optimism that are kind of doing this consistent airdrop behavior, which I'm a really big fan of. But I think that points take that even a step further, where it's like day one, you launch an app with a point system. You're incentivizing certain behaviors. You're giving people points when they're signing up for your app. You're giving them points for doing the actions that you want to see happen. But you're not locked into that system being that way in its entirety. You can constantly change and iterate it. You can say, hey, we want to decrease the amount that you get from signing up today. We want to change the incentives that we're giving to people for doing X, Y, and Z actions because we saw that this is a stickier behavior than something else. And I think that modularity to be able to push people into certain directions relative to what's working in real time, it's a very different mental model from giant airdrop that has $1 billion, fully diluted market cap to instead now like much more iterative, much more real time. Let's engage with our users on a day-to-day basis and then build those behaviors and actions into something that can be worth a lot more in the future.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad that you mentioned Optimism and their sort of iterative like seasons approach for the airdrops. I think that is an incredibly good idea. Uniswap did, one large airdrop. And so they missed this opportunity to like basically incentivize certain actions that I think would have been very good. And I think those behaviors are not just about, getting TVL, like, value locked up, something like that. It can be things that really enhance the user's experience that they're just like guiding you towards. So an example would be if you have a wallet and that a best security practice would be to like add another signer to your wallet, right? Just so that there's like a backup or backup your private keys or something. Like if you just guide the user towards doing that and you give them some points, similar to like how, like a LinkedIn would say, you get more points if you fill out your profile. It's a win-win situation where like they get to guide you through this thing. You get points, but then you also get a better user experience. You don't like get locked out of your account because you don't have like a backup key or something. Those are like great things to incentivize. And you can do, iterative redemptions for various like types of assets to keep that program like hot and make sure that it feels like it's a rewarding experience. One thing that I think projects might, struggle with the point system, especially an off-chain one, is that it can be difficult to organize like a redemption that is not like a big token drop. And so if they do that for too long, it can seem a little bit like the points are just this like bait and switch where they're kind of saying, oh yeah, there's this point system. And like, in crypto, we know what that means is likely to be some kind of reward, like that's redeemable. But if they take too long on doing any kind of redemption, then I think people can kind of feel a little bit like helpless, like, okay, I've been doing all these things, earning all these like points, but the points are not redeemable for anything. And so am I being kind of like attention rugged here, where like I'm giving my attention and time to this protocol, but then there's like, what's the point of points? Like, so it'll be up to the projects to like make the user feel like they're being rewarded like along the way, even if they don't have immediate plans for like a big token drop or something.
Well, I think something that's been interesting for me too is wondering like if the form factor of on-chain points are going to create a different kind of psychological relationship with earning assets as an on-chain user. Because to your example right there, I totally agree that most people will see a crypto project that has an off-chain point system and they'll basically just say, hey, I'm waiting to farm the giant airdrop. You know, like these aren't worth anything today, but they're going to be worth something in the future. And if each of these points was worth $1, I would make, you know, $10,000 because I have 10,000 points on this app. And I think this behavior of like waiting for there to be a giant airdrop moment is somewhat unhealthy because not all apps are meant to be designed in that way. You know, I think in a lot of ways we're noticing that people are spinning up frames for 24 hours, 72 hours, like they're kind of iterating in a much faster manner. And I think being able to allow there to be systems where you can earn 100 points in an app and then redeem those 100 points for USDC on base, and you're not making $10,000, but you made $50, $100, et cetera. I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about the current progression about crypto is I think that in a lot of ways we're moving away from like you're making $1 million overnight from some giant airdrop to you're just earning consistent, sustainable on-chain revenue where you're making $50, $100 a month. And that might not be as sexy as the 1000x meme coin play, but I think it is a lot more applicable to the vast majority of the world where they don't have an intention to want to enter this giant casino and hit 1000x. They just want to make a little bit more money to cover their bottom line and pay their rent. And I think that, you know, my personal assumption is that on-chain points get us closer to this world of making a consistent on-chain revenue and away from this world of expecting there to be life-changing money on the end of a gambling casino type play.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, Chris Dixon frames it as like a casino culture, right? Where it's like crypto can go two ways. It can go this like really like open, ground up, innovative thing where people are developing and it's very sustainable. Blockchain makes it more sustainable than open source in general because you have the value there that you can distribute. But then the problem is that crypto can go this other way, which is casino culture. And casino culture is essentially, where people are spinning up 10,000 accounts. They're taking random actions on this protocol, trying to get an airdrop to make a lot of money like overnight. And some people win that game and some people don't do as well. So making that like a little bit more consistent with something like points like makes a lot of sense to me. I still believe very much in the ownership economy thesis and like having tokens be a form of ownership over the protocols. I think that that's beautiful, but I agree. I think we're on the same page that I think there needs to be a better like intermediary like step to get there. Like how do you actually like allocate those, reliably over time in like small quantities that makes it like more consistent.
It's pretty fascinating that airdrop culture is still as relevant as it is today. And frankly, that it's still as profitable as it is today. I feel like as someone who was there when Uniswap had their airdrop and I received an airdrop across multiple wallets to like DeFi summer was just entirely like you're going and trying to farm for airdrops. I thought that by 2024, we would have moved away from that. But honestly, most of my friends who have been in crypto, they just want to keep farming airdrops. Like they look to like these new L1s that are launching, they look to these new L2s that are launching, and they're like, okay, how do I do actions that are super unnatural to me as like just a regular person solely just to get this token incentive? Like I have friends in high school who aren't technical at all that are looking into spinning up like a node for Monad because they like think that the Monad airdrop is going to be worth a lot, but like they're not using any apps on top of it. And I think that one thing that I'm trying to figure out is like, how do we get this behavior of like farming an airdrop to be exciting for things that are more progressive for the space of a whole, so that it's less about like you farming governance tokens on a new L1 or an L2 to more behaviors of like using consumer products that are actually pushing forward what it means to use a consumer product and a crypto product in a way that feels progressive to the space as a whole. So I don't know if there's like a question there. It's more just commentary, but I am just genuinely surprised that like the main use case for people transacting on chain today is to do 50 random actions on this random chain in the hope that it's going to earn you an airdrop over there being much more of like a clear social experience or a clear consumer behavior that's like exists in the world today. And I'm curious to hear if you agree with that and what you think the path is for that to kind of change over the next couple of years here.
Yeah, great. So, there's a lot to react to, I think, in what you said. One thing that comes to mind when you talk about the Uniswap airdrop, which was this beautiful thing where like we were sitting, it was like the beginning of the pandemic and ETH was at like $80 or something, and everybody got this like $2,000 like Uniswap airdrop. I was at Dharma at the time, and we had built this smart contract wallet system that backed the app, which meant that all of the orders on Uniswap got routed through the smart contract. And so when the accounting went out for like the allocations, there was like one single allocation to the sort of the proxy, not the proxy, but the implementation contract for the Uniswap router, basically, at Dharma, which meant that our users didn't get any airdrop, and like our smart contract wallet got one airdrop, and it was like stuck in the wallet because we didn't have a way to like pull the funds out of the smart contract. So this is kind of like mess that happened because nobody was really aware of what the allocations would be beforehand, and it was just one big drop. And so the Dharma team at the time, we actually organized a governance proposal to retroactively reward people like who had used Matcha and Argent and Dharma. So that these were all smart contract wallets that had users. The users didn't get the airdrop even though they were using Uniswap through the contract. If they had done that like more iteratively with point systems, it would have been a lot more obvious to people. We would have known immediately, our users don't get any points even though they're using this proxy, and we would have remedied it before the airdrop happened. So I think that would have been like a really good win for points. And I think similarly with Starknet. So it's basically a way to like fix the communication problem between the issuer of these like airdrops and their users to align them better like over time. Because right now the alignment is basically like very unspoken. It's like we're going to have an airdrop and you can take some user behavior that classifies you as an early user and we'll like kind of figure it out behind the scenes. But points make it more explicit. And so I think that is going to be like a really good win for aligning users with like the applications and getting them to take the behaviors that they want to take. And then, as we've been saying before, making that iterative and saying there are these like seasons of drops or like different redeemables that you can claim along the way, whether they're like NFTs that are exclusive or they're like USDC, like you're saying. Those are like really good ways to make it like more sustainable. And there might be a bigger reward later if there's like some kind of token, but those you can't count on necessarily because how many of those are there? How many like $1 billion protocols are there going to be where you can like do this like decentralization? Right now it's like only a handful. So.
I think it's also been really helpful for us to go into the music lens for a second. So running an on-chain record label, we have all of these people who are collecting music on Sound. We have people who are coming to our events and whatnot. A loyalty program is super attractive to us because, to your earlier point, we don't have ambitions to launch like a giant governance token tomorrow, but we do really want to be incentivizing actions that people are taking today. And even when you start to look at the artists that are putting their music on chain, when you think about artists that are dropping on platforms like Sound and Catalog and Sona and Audius and whatnot, you're going to want to create systems that assign incentives to all of the different ways that you can engage with the user's content that aren't specifically bound to one platform. And so, for example, here, I can be earning reputation on Sound XYZ when I collect songs on there, but there is a very wide net of ways that you can interact with someone's content on chain and in the world in general. And I think that loyalty programs are really uniquely positioned to capture all those activities. I don't want to really go too deep into the whole world of like, how do you incentivize and reward people streaming your music on Spotify and making videos on TikTok? Because that's like this whole big mess of like tracking off-chain data. But basically what I'm trying to say is why I get excited about loyalty programs in music is that we can finally start to create an incentive where as a fan, you are earning an asset that is specifically related to that artist you're interacting with. And if that artist is actually true to their loyalty program, that can be translated into real value. Now, I'm not going to say that this is going to be a $50,000 airdrop from $1 billion token project, but I think there is a real world where fans are starting to earn $5, $10, $20 worth of points because they're engaging with their favorite artists on a frequent basis. And I think as us running a record label, we are really excited about introducing loyalty programs to all of these different artists and projects in our ecosystem, because I think it's a lot healthier way of incentivizing actions that we want to see, much more than the promise of a future airdrop, which I think is a very intimidating step for someone to take who hasn't been in crypto for 7 years prior to that.
That makes sense. Yeah, and then the accessibility of the data is a core piece of that, because you can have an artist create the album art and publish it on Zora, and like people can mint that. They can write, some like lyrics or some announcement or some teaser on Farcaster. that data is available as well. Then they can do their actual drop on sound XYZ, and you can aggregate these things into your loyalty program. And this is done with like Stack doesn't need to know what you're doing, Zora doesn't need to know what you're doing, Farcaster doesn't need to know what you're doing. But because you can like run the nodes yourself, you can just collect all of this data, aggregate it, create the loyalty system that you want, and there you go. The user has this thing that can be like redeemable for, some like exclusive, NFT, which can be like backstage pass, like VIP, whatever, based on their history of interacting with the brand or artist. Which is amazing, I think, for crypto.
It's very interesting for someone like me, and I think that you're in a very similar position. I feel like in a lot of ways, crypto is mostly about just like staying ahead of the curve on new ways to use the most current, exciting forms of the technology. And so, you mentioned earlier that we're starting to get into this world where layer 3s exist now. On-chain points are kind of this new primitive. How much do you feel like, having been involved in crypto for so long, the new thing is the best thing versus the value is just being around the new thing, because the new thing is always the one that has the most design space and opportunity for you to create value as a founder in the space?
Yeah, loaded question. I think that the old thing sometimes changes as well. So I'd add that, we started out on Ethereum L1 and we were using Uniswap on Ethereum L1. It was like you could buy socks on Uniswap and then you could like integrate everything. And then, we had this like L2 centric roadmap, and now the new thing is like the L2s. But there's kind of like no going back to the old thing. So I don't feel like it's a case of just chasing the new thing. It's kind of just like naturally following the natural path that the technology is taking. So in order to scale, I joined full time into crypto at a time where I didn't believe that it could scale. Honestly, I had to suspend my disbelief because I'd known a bit about database sharding and I knew about the transaction fees, and it didn't quite make sense to me that Ethereum L1 would be able to scale. So I was like, okay, but set that aside. Let's assume that like the internet itself, like blockchains will be able to scale in some manner. And then eventually you learn about, ZK proofs, and you learn about the different layers and like all these things that you can end up doing. That transformed, from things like Plasma and side chains into like this like L2 and now L3 infrastructure. And so there's kind of this natural progression, and I think it's super interesting for us, to just follow that and like see what makes sense. And then what we get to do by having like a good background pursuing these things, like we get the opportunity to go and like explore an idea. So for Stack, we were able to like, raise like a seed round, and just go and explore this new idea and basically say like, given all the things I've done so far, where I see the technology going, where I see users like interacting, I think that there's like a product that exists here, and that has the chance of being, a successful product. So I think that that's what's like really exciting about this technology. It's like there's so much innovation happening, and I look at like things like AI, and I'm like really happy that I'm in crypto. I just think that there's so much that you can do here, and you can kind of like take these historical things, like things that have been around a long time, like music, collecting art, loyalty systems, things like that exist in the traditional world. And then the job is almost like artistically to say, how does that fit into a blockchain context? And then the task is to go and like, figure out the thing that is like scalable, but also is appropriate for the medium, which is like the blockchain, right? It's a lot of
Can you go a little bit more into I don't want you to leak too much alpha here, but in our last conversation, you had some pretty amazing plans for where you see Stack going and how you see it evolving. Obviously, I think that today we've been talking about like loyalty programs, on-chain points programs, et cetera, standing those up for different consumer applications, standing those up for platforms and crypto protocols that exist today. Where do you see a product like Stack going over the next couple of years? And what can you share with people that are thinking about building on Stack today and why that might be valuable for them moving forward with their projects?
Right. Okay. Well, I can start with this, one idea, which is app chains. There's this app chain thesis. I'm sure you're very aware. I think Jesse Walden wrote something about this like many, many years ago, about this transition that we'll have from like the mainframe computer, which does like one big blockchain, to these like app chains. Chris Dixon calls blockchains virtual computers. They're kind of like these little virtual computers that run, and they run a set of rules. How we're thinking about it is, instead of thinking of Stack as like an app chain, we're kind of thinking of it as like a particular domain or like a niche. And then we want to like do the protocol like in this chain that's like for this particular theme. The theme that we've picked are these point systems, like points loyalty systems. So we're kind of thinking of this as like the points chain, if you will. And it has one core contract that we've like spent a lot of time on, and we're getting audited, and it just does one thing really well, which is, you know, point systems and managing point systems. That's deployed to a chain that is specifically for that core protocol, but people can, you know, that's like the virtual computer for points, and people can deploy their own programs to that computer, and they can like extend it. So we have mainnet right now. We have 550 point systems deployed. They're pretty pseudonymous, so like people can't really like tell exactly whose point systems are whose. So it's not like just this public thing where if you put your point system, it's just inherently public. It can be if you want to, but it can also be private. But that's where you can basically use this virtual computer to manage your points and loyalty program. From there, you can just extend it, you know, and because it's a chain, it's a public chain, you can run your own node, and you can basically own your own points program, and you can extend it however you want to. So if you want to create some kind of like badge system that ties into the point system, you can deploy your own badge NFT to that chain and just interact with your point system directly. So if a user gets more than 100 points, they get like this badge. You know, they could be like gold tier if they get 200, or platinum if they get 300, something like that. And, you know, Stack doesn't have to be involved in that. And that's the beauty of the bottom up sort of way that these ecosystems can work, because nobody essentially like owns this chain. Anybody can deploy to it. And that's the basic thesis, and we've done that as a L3 rollup.
And so I guess in closing thoughts here, what is your current take on the status of consumer crypto as a whole, the current take on where you see the space evolving over the next year here? You know, obviously we're entering into a place where Bitcoin's reaching an all-time high, ETH going close to an all-time high. The market as a whole is just pumping. Like, how are you feeling as a founder that's designing a system for the new generation of crypto, and what your sentiment is headed into these next couple months here?
Very excited. I think for the first time that I've been in crypto, it's actually scaling. And so I think people might not understand like how profound that is, but for as long as like we've been in crypto, we've been on this like L1, this mainnet, and it's had these transaction fees that, if you remember going back to when CryptoKitties launched, you know, the transactions were as high as they were like, you know, in the DeFi somewhere. Like they go ballistic because we were all just on this like physically constrained computer. And so for the first time, we're actually seeing scaling. And so you can deploy something to Base that's significantly cheaper, and you can have a trading venue there that is, you know, cents to $1 or so for making a trade after this upgrade on March 12th, I think. So that's going to be beautiful. And so there are going to be all these financial applications. And then, you know, for these like L3s, I think you can have these really cool new systems that get built, new products. And I'm very excited for that. I'm very excited to see things like e-commerce move on chain more natively. And it was not feasible to run those things on L1. And I suddenly see that it's feasible. And so there's all of this opportunity. And I hope that people see that there's a bit of a bull market coming, and a lot of product founders like rush back into crypto and they start building these things out, because there's a lot to do. There's a lot of amazing products. So in generally, I'm very bullish on consumer crypto. I'm super excited to see what you're building. And I think all of these things are going to be new and very interesting. And there's going to be a lot of crazy things, but there's also going to be a lot of really good products that come out.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on to unpack the subject. I know that points have been a topic of conversation for quite a long time now, but I genuinely believe the way you're approaching it is really fascinating. I think has a ton of application. So we're going to be sharing what we've been building with the point system very soon. If you're listening to this, Coop Records point system coming soon, TM. It's a big year for on-chain points, and I feel like you're at the helm here. So in closing thoughts here, Graeme, if people want to stay up with you or any of the work that you're doing with Stack, what's the best place for them to do so?
Right. Thank you. So the website is stack.so, stack.so. We have a Twitter X profile, which is at stack.so, just spelled out. And then on Farcaster, where there's just a community space, so /stack, that's the channel. And people can post any questions they have there, any feedback. We're also available on Telegram. That's in the product. You can access that. And then I'm available personally on Twitter at Strange Chances. So anybody can like reach out to me there and like follow along. Super excited to work with people. Anybody who wants to onboard their point system on chain, super happy to like get into like a shared Slack and make that happen. Amazing.
Well, here's the year points. Graeme, thank you for your time, and I'm excited to watch these things unfold over the next couple of years here. So we'll have to have you back on when things are going in a healthy direction.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Cooper.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next week.
See you.